Hi class, today's lesson will be methods other than activity-based methods or simplifying the activity-based methods. We're still going to be looking at chapter 4 and I want to work some exercises with you. So if you'll hang on just a second, I'll bring up my Excel. All right, what I'd like to go over with you today is exercise 4-7. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be simplifying the activity-based costing system with the method that we call the time-driven activity-based costing method. And what this method does is it simplifies the process of creating an ABC system. If you've read your chapter, there are multiple steps that you have to make to create an ABC system. One of those is to create an interview system, which would interview workers and collect data about different costs and how you would want to assign the cost. This method could be really time consuming, so there's some shortcut methods to the regular ABC system that will eliminate that interview process. And the method that I want to talk to you about today, the first method that I want to talk to you about today, is the time-driven activity-based costing method. So what they've given us in this exercise is that we're going to be a bank and we're providing following data about its resource and activities for the checking account process. So what we found when we studied the checking account process for the bank is that we have some activities called processing accounts that will take place. One of our costs or our resources that we're going to have to distribute, one of our overhead costs is for supervision of $70,000. Our activities are processing accounts, issuing statements, processing transactions, and answering customer inquiries. These are the activities that we're going to divide up and assign them the overhead cost to. The overhead cost will be for supervision, phone and supplies cost, which is $90,000, salaries of the other employees that we're working with at the bank that are part of the check processing is $275,000. We also utilize a computer that cost about $25,000. If you add up all your resources together, the total amount of the overhead that we're going to want to distribute between each one of these activities is $460,000. The total check processing hours, which we're going to call practical capacity, is 25,000 hours that they think that it's going to take to process all the checks for this particular bank for a particular period of time. So practical capacity is the total amount of hours that they think it's going to take to go through the checking account process, and that's what we're going to call the practical capacity. In requirement number 1, they want you to calculate the capacity cost rate for the checking account process. And they want you to round your answers to the nearest cent. There's a formula to do that. And to calculate the capacity cost rate, we're going to need to know what our total resources are. The total overhead that we are planning to spend for this company is $460,000. We're going to divide that total overhead cost by the practical capacity. The practical capacity is the total number of check processing hours that it's going to take us to process our checks through our accounts at the bank. So when you divide the total cost of overhead, which is $460,000, by the practical capacity that was given at $25,000, it will give you the capacity cost rate. When you're using the time-driven activity-based costing, you need to find the activity cost rate first. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually calculate an activity rate for the 4 activities that we're using. So if you want to think of this like this is the entire bank's capacity cost rate, now we're going to divide this amount up by the amount of time that's spent on each one of the activities. So I started by writing down or just making a list of the activities first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this capacity cost rate and I'm going to multiply it by the time per unit. That will give me the activity rate. So the formula to calculate the activity rate is the capacity cost rate that we found in requirement number 1. And we're going to multiply it by the time per unit in each one of the activities. So we'll start with the processing accounts, since that's the first activity that they started with. And what we will do is we'll take the $18.40 and multiply it by 20 parts of 1 hour. And that will give us the activity rate for processing accounts. You'll do the same thing for issuing statements. You're going to take the capacity cost rate and multiply it by the time it takes for the issuing statement activity, which is 1/10 of an hour. So if you multiply $18.40 times 10% or 10 parts of an hour, it will give you the activity rate per hour for issuing statements, which is $1.80. For processing transactions, pick up your capacity cost rate, multiply it by the time it takes per unit to process the transactions. And this was 5 parts of an hour. And so 5% of 1 hour times $18.40 will give you 92 cents. To calculate the activity rate for answering customer inquiries, we're going to take the capacity cost rate and multiply it by 15 parts of 1 hour, or 15%. So 18.40 times 15% will give you $2.76, which is the activity rate. Notice we calculated an activity rate for each one of the activities. Then what we're going to do is we're going to need to calculate the total cost. And I want you to read carefully here what they wanted in part 2 of requirement number 2. It says, if the total number of statements issued, so we're just looking at the issuing statements activity. If the total number of issuing statements issued activity was 20,000, they want you to calculate the cost of what it we would have applied to the cost of the issuing statements activity. So because we're talking about issuing statements, we got to refer back to our activity rate. And that capacity or activity rate would be multiplied by the number of statements that are issued. So B25, which is your activity rate, is going to be multiplied by the number of statements that are issued. And that will give you the total amount that would be applied to the issuing statements activity. And so I think I got a, let's see, I think I could have better stated this as the activity rate here, not the capacity cost rate, but the activity rate. It should be activity rate times the total number of statements issued. See, we calculated an activity rate here, and the activity rate for issuing statements was $1.84. We would need to multiply that by the number of statements that were issued, which was 20,000, and that would give you the total amount that we would apply to our issuing statements activity. So they only ask you for one of these, not all four of them. But technically, they would have asked you for all four of them. So what we would needed to know was what each one of these activities, what was driving it, and how much we actually used. They didn't give us enough information to do that. So we just could use only what they have given us for the issuing statements activity. In part 3, ask us, what if process improvements actually decrease the number of customer inquiries? And that led to a 10% reduction in the check processing hours. And it also led to a $10,000 reduction in the total resource cost. What they want you to do is calculate the capacity cost rate for the checking account process. So they want you to find a new capacity cost rate, in other words. So what we had to do was we had to determine what the total amount of our cost was if we decrease the customer inquiries. And you can see here that it led to a 10% reduction in the check processing hours and a $10,000 reduction in cost. So if our cost before these improvements was this amount, and because our instructions told us we've reduced it by $10,000, the cost of the resource after the improvements is going to be $450,000. We also have to adjust the check processing hours because there was a 10% reduction in those hours. So 25,000 was the check processing hours before we made the change. And so 10% of 25,000 will give you the reduction in check processing hours because of the improvement that we made. And so we actually reduced our check processing hours in this what if analysis to 22,500. Then what we would do is we would take these check processing hours and divide it into the total resource cost, which will give you $20 as the new capacity cost rate. And then using that same what if analysis, it says to update all the activity rates for these changes in operating conditions. So if the capacity cost rate changed, then we have to multiply this capacity cost rate by the time that was spent on each activity. So it's really like what we did before. It's just that we now have a new capacity cost rate. So the capacity cost rate of $20 would be multiplied by 20 parts of an hour for processing accounts, and that would give you $4 as the activity rate for processing accounts. For issuing statements, it's $20 times the time it took to issue the statements, which was 10 parts of an hour, 10% of an hour. And if you multiply that out, it'll give you $2 as the activity rate. For processing transactions, it's $20 times the time it takes to process those transactions, which is 0.05. So 20 times 0.05 is $1. For answering inquiries, it's 20 times 15 parts of an hour. So 15% times 20 will give you $3. And that's all they wanted you to do in this particular problem. Again, this problem was about time-driven activity-based costing. This is a method that will help us to simplify our regular activity-based costing method, because it can get so complicated, it's necessary to simplify it. And when we simplify the system, we're just eliminating some of the steps required to build the ABC system. One of the steps that we will eliminate by using the time-driven activity-based costing is we eliminate the interview step. And so it'll save us some time in calculating the cost if we use the time-driven activity-based costing method. The next problem that I want to go over with you is also a method of simplifying the ABC system. It's a separate method, and we're going to call this one DBC, and this is what we call duration-based costing. And duration-based costing is based on time. And we're going to talk about cycle time in here. That's a new term in this chapter. Cycle time is the time it takes us to produce one unit. We're going to also apply to this the practical capacity, and that's the number of units that we're expecting to produce of our products. There are going to be two products in this problem, printer A and printer B. And printer A and printer B, they've just broken down the products by the activities. So you can see how many hours are devoted to each one of the products. And then they added all the total hours together. And then they also gave you the activities with consumption ratios and cost. And so for printer A and B, they gave you the amount of the consumption ratio and cost for each one of these products. For printer A, they used 20%, printer B, they used 80%. For activities changeover, for assembly, they calculated it at 60 and 40%. They've given you all this information here. So when we do duration-based costing, they want us to, first of all, calculate the total time for all the primary activities. And so to do that, what you would do is you would take the cycle time and you would multiply it by the number of units at practical capacity. And so the total time that it takes for us to produce printer A is 25,000 hours. I got that by multiplying the cycle time times the practical capacity. That's the number of units that we could expect to be able to produce a printer A. So 2.5 times 10,000 practical capacity units of printer A means that printer A's total time is going to be 25,000. So we're calculating the total time for all of our activities. For printer B, we're going to take 1.25, our cycle time, and multiply it by 20,000, our practical capacity, and it too gives us 25,000 hours. When you combine both printers together, the total time for this company is 50,000 hours. So the total time is 50,000 hours. Determine it first when you are calculating by duration-based costing. In part 2, they want you to calculate the overhead rate. And the overhead rate is found by taking the total overhead cost and dividing it by the total time. Your total overhead cost was given. The total overhead cost for both printers for this company's activities, all the activities combined, are $310,000. The total overhead cost is going to be divided by the total time, and that will give you the overhead rate for this company. So this is the total for all the products and all the activities. The total overhead costs were $310,000. You're going to divide that by the total time that we found in part 1, and that will give you the overhead rate. The overhead rate is $6.20. Now, in the third part, they want us to use the overhead rate that we calculated in requirement 2 to calculate the overhead cost per unit for each product. So what we would need to do is we would need to figure out what the total overhead cost was for or per unit. And to do that, we're going to take our overhead rate that we calculated in part 2, and we're just going to multiply it by the time it takes to produce 1 unit. That will give you the overhead cost per unit. Now, there's probably several different ways you could have come up with that, but this is what they emphasize in your textbook. And so just use this formula. It's kind of simple. Take the overhead rate that you calculated before, multiply it back by the cycle time, and that will give you the overhead cost per unit for printer A, and to do the same thing for printer B. This times the cycle time for printer B, which is 1.25, gives you $7.75 as the overhead cost per unit for printer B. And then to determine the total amount of the overhead assigned to each product, you could take the overhead cost per unit and multiply it by the number of units that you produced. So in printer A, we're producing 10,000 units. So I would take the $15.50, multiply it by 10,000 units, and that'll give you the total overhead cost for A at $155,000. For B, we would take the overhead cost per unit, which is $7.75. We would multiply it by the number of units produced. And the number of units produced of printer B was 20,000 units. So 7.75 times 20,000 is 155,000 as the overhead cost of printer B. And part 4 is a what if analysis. And in part 4, the what if analysis is telling you that the units that are actually produced were 10,000 for printer A and 18,000 for printer B. Using the duration-based costing, we want you to calculate the cost of the unused capacity. So since printer A actually produced 10,000 units and the practical capacity was 10,000 units, we don't have any unused capacity. But for printer B, our practical capacity was 20,000 units, but we only produced 18,000 according to our what if analysis. So there were 2,000 units that were unused, or unused capacity amounted to 2,000 units. So we would take the amount of the unused capacity and multiply it by the overhead rate. Now this is just for printer B, because printer A, there was no unused capacity. So for printer B, because we produced 18,000 units and we thought we could produce 20,000, we had some unused capacity of 2,000 units. And this 2,000 units would be multiplied by the overhead rate for printer B, which is $7.75. And that would give you an unused capacity cost of $15,500. And so both of the methods that we've discussed today are methods to simplify the ABC system. And it doesn't matter which method you choose, either method will work, but they operate differently. So I want you to take a look at each of the formulas that we use for each of these methods, and study that and look over it. And that's all I'm going to talk to you about today. So we're going to stop sharing this, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.